How do you address and call people? By their names, right? It's the same with functions. You call them by their names. This calling of a function is also known as invoking a function. Now if you see, when we created this function, we created it outside the main function. Try executing this function. What? It does not show any output. Well, that's because it's the main function that decides what needs to be executed, and right now this function that we have created lies outside the main function. You can also say that only the code written inside the main function gets executed, or that the main function is the starting point of any program. So then, should we put this function inside the main function? It may seem fine for now, but with lengthy code you cannot have everything inside the main function. So we create the actual function outside the main function, and then we call this function inside the main function. This way, the main function knows that this function needs to be executed. This is how we do it. We write the function name and pass the arguments in the parentheses. Since this function does not have arguments, we will use empty parentheses. Now try executing this program. We get the output that we expected. Now since we as users have created this function on our own, these are called user-defined functions. Now let's look at another function. So let's create a function called times2. We want this function to take a variable and multiply it by 2 to give us the result. So we will pass this integer variable x as an argument. The return type of the output variable will also be an integer, so we mention that here. Now inside the block body, we declare a val type variable called output. And we give the expression for calculating the output here. Now in this return statement, we simply pass this variable output as the result that needs to be returned. Now let's call this function in the main function like this. As you can see, we have passed the variable and its value in the parentheses here while calling the function. Now let's run this code and look at the output. What? No output? Why did this happen? Well, if you read the code closely, you will notice that we have only calculated the result in the function, but we have not printed this result. That's what was missing. So now, instead of just calling this function in the main function here, let's print the result of this function. This is how we can do it. Now, let's run this function and get the output. Now, if you look at this variable, there is a gray line underlining it. Looks like the IDE is trying to tell us something. Let's hover over it to read. The IDE says that variable used only in following return and should be inlined. We do not know what this means, but don't worry, the IDE also gives suggestions to correct the code. All we need to do is place the cursor over the output variable and press Alt plus Enter if you are a Windows user. From the options that appear, select Inline Variable since that was what the IDE suggested. Now let's hit Enter here. As you can see now, the IDE has removed the variable output since the expression for calculating result can be a part of the return statement itself and does not need a variable. Now let's change the block body of this function to an expression body and shorten this function further. This is how we do it. As you can see, we have removed the return type from this function now, since Kotlin looks at the arguments passed and infers the return type to be integer. Now, let's run this function and get the output. As you can see, we get the same output as we did earlier, which means that we did everything right and have managed to make the function short and neat. That was all about user-defined functions. Click next to learn more.